She called the police because a Rolls-Royce was parked in her neighbor's driveway. She swore it used to belong to her late husband and accused her neighbor of stealing it. But when the truth came out, it wasn't just the car that left her speechless. It was who actually owned it. It wasn't the sound of sirens that stirred the neighborhood that morning. It was the silence that followed. Two police cruisers idling quietly at the curb, engines low like a held breath. A sleek black Rolls-Royce Ghost gleamed in the sun, parked neatly in the driveway of a modest white brick home at the corner of Magnolia Lane. It didn't belong, at least that's what one woman insisted. Mrs. Judith Crane, longtime resident and self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood order, stood at the edge of the lawn with arms folded tightly across her designer tracksuit. Her lips were pressed into a frown of righteous certainty. "That's my car," she told the officers. Or rather, it was, until it ended up here. Inside the house, Malcolm Hayes sat at his kitchen table, halfway through his second cup of coffee and a slice of buttered toast. 60 years old, retired, quiet by nature and by choice, he'd always preferred to avoid drama, letting his garden grow and his days move with calm predictability. But not today. He glanced out the window at the uniformed officers and the woman who'd called them. Then, with a sigh as soft as the morning breeze, he stood up and reached for a manila folder he had tucked away in the drawer beside the sink. This wasn't just about a car, not to him, and maybe not even to her, because sometimes the most ordinary driveways become battlegrounds. Over ego, over pride, over the unseen lines people draw when they believe they matter more than others. And in neighborhoods like this, where lawns are trimmed with military precision and whispers move faster than mail, things like this don't go unnoticed. Malcolm had lived in Sarasota, Florida for almost 20 years. He was a science teacher for most of his life. Kind, consistent, the sort of man who returned grocery carts and knew the mailman's first name. After retiring, he bought the house on Magnolia Lane, where he tended to roses, read paperback thrillers, and enjoyed the quiet rhythm of being left alone. Judith Crane lived next door. She wasn't someone who enjoyed being left alone. She preferred to be at the center of things. For years, she ran the HOA, patrolling the street like it was her private kingdom. She issued warnings over trash bins, fined people for having mismatched patio furniture, and once told Malcolm that his porch wind chimes were audibly disruptive. So when Malcolm rolled in one Friday evening with a brand new Rolls-Royce, no one was more stunned and more suspicious than Judith. A man like him, with that kind of car? The moment she saw it in his driveway, something inside her snapped into action. And when she called the police to report the vehicle as potentially stolen, she had no idea that what would unfold next, quietly, calmly, and undeniably, would not only change how she saw Malcolm, but how the entire neighborhood saw her. When Malcolm opened the door that Saturday morning, he wasn't surprised to see two police officers standing on his front steps. What did surprise him was how calm he felt. Behind them, the quiet buzz of curiosity was already rippling through the neighborhood. A dog barked 3 doors down. A pair of wind chimes clinked in the breeze. Somewhere a lawnmower paused mid-growl. Someone had shut it off just to listen. And standing a few feet back, arms folded and chin high, was Judith Crane. One of the officers, a young man with mirrored sunglasses and a clipboard, cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report about a vehicle on your property. May we speak with you about the Rolls-Royce?" Malcolm nodded. "Of course. Do you mind telling us how the vehicle came into your possession?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "I purchased it from the dealership in Tampa. Cash down, the rest financed. Got the paperwork inside if you'd like to see it." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then tilted his head. "If you don't mind." Malcolm stepped back, calm as ever. "Come on in." Inside, the house was neat and still. Cool air humming from the vents, a pot of tea steeping on the counter, jazz playing low from a Bluetooth speaker. Malcolm returned moments later with a manila folder. He handed it over without a word. The officers examined each page. A clean bill of sale, bank transaction receipts, vehicle registration, insurance papers, and a time-stamped photo of Malcolm shaking hands with the dealership manager. Keys in hand, the Rolls-Royce glinting in the background. It was all there. No room for doubt. Outside, Judith shifted impatiently on the front walk, arms still crossed like a defiant schoolteacher, waiting to scold a child. Her voice was sharper when they returned. But not today. He glanced out the window at the uniformed officers and the woman who'd called them. Then, with a sigh as soft as the morning breeze, he stood up and reached for a manila folder he had tucked away in the drawer beside the sink. This wasn't just about a car. Not to him, and maybe not even to her. Because sometimes the most ordinary driveways become battlegrounds. Over ego, over pride, over the unseen lines people draw when they believe they matter more than others. And in neighborhoods like this, where lawns are trimmed with military precision and whispers move faster than mail, things like this don't go unnoticed. Malcolm had lived in Sarasota, Florida for almost 20 years. He was a science teacher for most of his life. Kind, consistent, the sort of man who returned grocery carts and knew the mailman's first name. After retiring, he bought the house on Magnolia Lane, where he tended to roses, read paperback thrillers, and enjoyed the quiet rhythm of being left alone. Judith Crane lived next door. She wasn't someone who enjoyed being left alone. She preferred to be at the center of things. For years, she ran the HOA, patrolling the street like it was her private kingdom. She issued warnings over trash bins, fined people for having mismatched patio furniture, and once told Malcolm that his porch wind chimes were audibly disruptive. So when Malcolm rolled in one Friday evening with a brand new Rolls-Royce, no one was more stunned and more suspicious than Judith. A man like him, with that kind of car? The moment she saw it in his driveway, something inside her snapped into action. And when she called the police to report the vehicle as potentially stolen, she had no idea that what would unfold next, quietly, calmly, and undeniably, would not only change how she saw Malcolm, but how the entire neighborhood saw her. When Malcolm opened the door that Saturday morning, he wasn't surprised to see two police officers standing on his front steps. What did surprise him was how calm he felt. Behind them, the quiet buzz of curiosity was already rippling through the neighborhood. A dog barked 3 doors down. A pair of wind chimes clinked in the breeze. Somewhere, a lawnmower paused mid-growl. Someone had shut it off just to listen. And standing a few feet back, arms folded and chin high, was Judith Crane. One of the officers, a young man with mirrored sunglasses and a clipboard, cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report about a vehicle on your property. May we speak with you about the Rolls-Royce?" Malcolm nodded. "Of course. Do you mind telling us how the vehicle came into your possession?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "I purchased it from the dealership in Tampa. Cash down, the rest financed. Got the paperwork inside if you'd like to see it." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner and then tilted his head. "If you don't mind." Malcolm stepped back, calm as ever. "Come on in." Inside, the house was neat and still, cool air humming from the vents, a pot of tea steeping on the counter, jazz playing low from a Bluetooth speaker. Malcolm returned moments later with a manila folder. He handed it over without a word. The officers examined each page: a clean bill of sale, bank transaction receipts, vehicle registration, insurance papers, and a time-stamped photo of Malcolm shaking hands with the dealership manager, keys in hand, the Rolls-Royce glinting in the background. It was all there. No room for doubt. Outside, Judith shifted impatiently on the front walk, arms still crossed like a defiant schoolteacher waiting to scold a child. Her voice was sharper when they returned. "Well," she demanded, "did he show you anything that proves he owns it? Because I know that car. I know it." The officer removed his sunglasses. "Ma'am, Mr. Hayes is the legal owner of the vehicle. All documentation checks out. There's no evidence of theft or any wrongdoing." For a moment, Judith didn't move. Her lips parted, then closed again. Around them, the silence grew thick. A curtain dropped back into place across the street. A neighbor on a bicycle slowed to a stop. And Malcolm just stood there. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He didn't even speak. Because what needed to be said had already been proven. Judith's face reddened, not just with frustration, but with something deeper: embarrassment, maybe disbelief. Like the story she had told herself about who Malcolm was and what he couldn't possibly afford had just shattered in full public view. She didn't say another word. She turned, walked back across the lawn with stiff, mechanical steps, disappeared into her house and shut the door behind her. The officers nodded politely and returned to their vehicle. Malcolm stood for a moment longer, looking out at the now quiet street, then went back inside. He poured himself a fresh cup of tea, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something unusual. Not victory, not vindication, just peace. For a while it seemed like everything had returned to normal. The police cars were gone, the papers had been filed away, the Rolls-Royce remained quietly parked in Malcolm's driveway like it had always belonged there, which of course it had. But the silence that followed wasn't quite the same as peace. It was thinner, tense, the kind of quiet that comes not after resolution, but before retaliation. Judith Crane may have lost the first round, but she wasn't the kind of woman to step away gracefully. 3 days after the confrontation, Malcolm found a bright yellow envelope tucked into the doorframe of his front porch. It was a citation from the Homeowners Association, citing him for non-uniform decorative elements, specifically the flower pots flanking his steps, the same pots that had sat there, unchanged for 2 years. 2 days later came another, a warning for leaving his trash bins out beyond the permitted retrieval window. Then a third, this time about excessive driveway activity, whatever that meant. Malcolm didn't respond. He simply placed the envelopes in a drawer next to the manila folder that held his vehicle documents. But others began to notice. Mrs. Lanning from across the street, who'd been fined last year for hanging wind chimes, called Malcolm to say she'd seen Judith drop something into his mailbox. Tom Rodriguez, who lived 2 houses down, knocked one evening with a quiet chuckle and a bottle of lemonade. "She's gunning for you, man," he said, shaking his head, "but I've got your back." More neighbors started to speak up, quietly at first, then louder. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, unsigned, professionally printed, warning about uncooperative neighbors and vehicles that disturb the community aesthetic. It was classic Judith, cloaked in concern, but dripping with condescension. Except this time, no one was buying it. People who had once kept their heads down, afraid of being cited for overgrown grass or patriotic garden flags, now saw the pattern for what it was, control disguised as decorum. And Malcolm? He remained still. He didn't fight fire with fire. He watered his lawn, washed his car, took morning walks with his shoulders a little straighter. And that's what made it worse for Judith. Her efforts to shame him only highlighted her own pettiness. It came to a head one Tuesday evening. Malcolm was out front, trimming his hedges, when a white SUV marked Community Security pulled up with its lights flashing. A tall guard stepped out, clipboard in hand, face pinched with self-importance. "Sir," he said stiffly, "we received a report of suspicious activity on this property." Malcolm raised an eyebrow and looked around. Suspicious activity, like gardening. The guard hesitated. Watering the lawn after sunset could be considered a waste of resources under HOA drought guidelines." Malcolm smiled. "You're welcome to check my water usage on the city report. I haven't gone over in 3 years." There was a pause, then the guard nodded awkwardly and left. Malcolm turned his head just slightly, just enough to catch a figure on a nearby porch. Judith. She stood there, arms crossed again, mouth tight, sunglasses on even in the fading light. She turned before he could see her expression. But she knew. She was losing. Not just her case, not just her status, her grip on the neighborhood. What she didn't count on was that her actions had created exactly what she feared most. A community. Not the one written into HOA bylaws, but the real kind. Neighbors talking, checking in, rolling their eyes together at the latest memo Judith sent out. Malcolm hadn't meant to start anything. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. But by simply standing firm, he had given the neighborhood permission to do the same. And something had started to shift. The fear was fading, and in its place, something stronger was taking root. The monthly HOA meeting had never been a big event. Most months it took place in a half-lit room at the community center, where 4 or 5 loyal residents would gather to sip lukewarm coffee and grumble about recycling bins or sidewalk cracks. But this month, the folding chairs were full. Neighbors who hadn't attended in years now sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering behind cupped hands. A few stood along the walls, arms crossed. The air was warm, tense like the moment before a summer storm, and at the head of the table, wearing a pale pink blazer and pearls, Judith Crane sat in her usual seat, clipboard resting like a gavel in her lap. She looked poised, composed, but her eyes scanned the room with uncertainty, because she could feel it. The tide had turned. Across from her, seated quietly near the back, was Malcolm Hayes. Navy polo shirt, khaki slacks, posture relaxed, no papers in hand, no accusations prepared. He was here not to speak, but to be seen. And that, it turned out, was enough. The meeting began as usual. Brief updates on landscaping bids, upcoming repairs to the front gate, and a new vendor for pest control. But everyone knew the real reason they were there. When the board president, a soft-spoken man named Ellis Greer, cleared his throat, the room fell still. "We've received multiple formal complaints," he said, glancing down at a folder. "These concern misuse of HOA authority, harassment, and retaliatory actions against community members." Judith's head lifted slightly. She adjusted her collar, ready to listen until Ellis continued. "These complaints," he said evenly, "are directed at board member Judith Crane." A few people gasped. One woman let out a soft, surprised, "Oh." Judith blinked. Once. Twice. "That can't be right," she said quickly. "Surely there's been a misunderstanding. I've only acted in the best interest of this neighborhood." Ellis didn't flinch. "The documentation we've received suggests otherwise. We've reviewed emails, security reports, HOA citations, many of which appear to be issued without proper cause." Another board member, a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Davison, leaned forward. "There have been multiple reports of personal targeting, particularly of Mr. Hayes." Judith's face hardened. "This is ridiculous. That man lied about his car. He tried to intimidate me in front of officers. And now he's trying to—" "No, Judith," said a deep voice from the crowd. It was Mr. Leonard Hargrove, who had lived on the block for over 2 decades. He stood slowly, steadying himself with a cane. "We're not taking side," he said gently. "We're just tired. Tired of your fines. Tired of your notes. Tired of the way you run this place like it's yours alone." A murmur of agreement swept the room. Even some of Judith's former allies looked away. Judith's voice wavered. "I've always upheld the standards this community agreed on." Ellis nodded, but his tone remained firm. "Which is why, in accordance with HOA bylaws, the board will now vote on whether your actions have violated the ethical responsibilities of your position." One by one, board members marked their ballots. No whispers, no theatrics. Just the scratch of pens and the weight of decision. When the final count was tallied, Ellis looked up. "By unanimous vote," he said, "Judith Crane is hereby removed from the HOA board, effective immediately." There was no applause, no cheers, just silence, and the quiet creak of Judith standing from her chair. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply picked up her clipboard, pressed her lips into a thin line, and walked out. As the door closed behind her, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, folded his hands in his lap, and exhaled. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't needed to. Sometimes the loudest kind of justice is the one delivered in silence, by a community that finally decides enough is enough. The days that followed the HOA meeting passed with a strange kind of stillness. Not the tense quiet of judgment or whispered rumors, but something softer, lighter, like a neighborhood remembering how to breathe again. Judith Crane didn't return to another meeting. She stopped walking her daily patrols. Her clipboard, once a fixture of front porch policing, was never seen again. For a while, she stayed out of sight, and then, almost quietly, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. It stood there for weeks, catching the light like a white flag. No one said much, but everyone understood. By the end of the season, her house was empty, the porch furniture gone, the windows dark. A moving van came and left in a single afternoon. She didn't say goodbye. No one expected her to. And for Malcolm Hayes, life didn't change dramatically. The Rolls-Royce still sat neatly in the driveway, polished, quiet, unbothered. He still drank his tea on the porch each morning, read the newspaper the old-fashioned way, and tended to his roses with the same care he always had. But something had shifted. Neighbors waved longer now. Some stopped to chat. A few even knocked on his door just to say thanks. Not for winning a battle, but for showing it could be done without ever raising your voice. One afternoon, a young couple from 3 houses down stopped by with a tin of cookies. The husband laughed awkwardly and said, "You know, for years we were afraid to put up a hammock because of HOA rules. But now," he looked around at his wife and their toddler toddling behind her. "Now it feels like we can just live here." And Malcolm smiled. Not out of pride, not even relief, just contentment. Because it wasn't about the car. It never really was. It was about being seen, being heard, being respected. He hadn't bought the Rolls Royce to make a statement. He'd bought it because, for once in his life, he wanted something extraordinary. Something that reflected not the world's judgment, but his own quiet worth. And someone tried to take that from him. Not the keys, not the title, but the right to feel like he belonged. And instead of shouting, instead of fighting fire with fire, Malcolm had done something far more radical. He stood still, and because of that stillness, because he didn't back down, didn't apologize for taking up space, he gave permission for others to do the same. In time, small changes swept the block. A grandmother down the street repainted her fence bright yellow. A Vietnam vet put up a flagpole that had sat in his garage for years. A teenager painted a mural in her backyard that would have once been flagged as a visual distraction. None of it was revolutionary, but all of it mattered. And Malcolm? He remained the same. The man with the calm gaze and the deep voice who didn't need to raise it to be heard. The man who had lived next to judgment, swallowed by silence, and chose dignity over drama. If you pass by Magnolia Lane today, you might not notice anything different. The lawns are still neat, the sidewalk's still quiet. But if you look closer, if you really see, you'll notice the spirit of a neighborhood slowly becoming what it was always meant to be. Not just a place to live, but a place where everyone has the right to stand their ground, park their car, plant their flowers, and, yes, be left in peace. And that's the kind of victory that doesn't need applause. Just sunlight, a porch, and maybe a cup of tea. Stories like this one don't just entertain us. They speak to something deeply human. They remind us of who we are, who we've become, and who we still have the power to be, even in the later chapters of life. The story of Malcolm Hayes and his neighbor Judith Crane isn't about a car. It's not about HOA rules, flower pots, or luxury driveways. It's about boundaries, dignity, and what happens when quiet people finally decide to stand their ground. And for those of us who've spent a lifetime trying to do the right thing, who've chosen civility over conflict, who've let things go just to keep the peace, this story feels familiar. Maybe a little too familiar, because there comes a point where being nice turns into being invisible, where being quiet turns into being underestimated, where patience, when abused, becomes a prison. Malcolm didn't fight with fists. He didn't argue. He didn't shout down the HOA board or slam doors or retaliate with gossip. Instead, he chose something far more powerful: self-respect. He gathered the facts, he trusted the truth, and he let it speak louder than his voice ever needed to. That alone is a lesson many of us take a lifetime to learn. So many older adults, especially those raised in traditional values, have been taught to keep your head down, mind your business, and take the high road. That's often noble, but this story reminds us that there's a difference between avoiding conflict and allowing disrespect. Patience should not mean surrender, and kindness does not mean letting others walk over you. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is draw a line and hold it. In a world that seems increasingly noisy, where arguments are broadcast, outrage is rewarded, and silence is seen as weakness, Malcolm's stillness was radical. He didn't raise his voice, but his actions, grounded in truth, carried more weight than shouting ever could. For many seniors, especially those from generations taught to not cause trouble, this is liberating. You don't need to match someone else's volume to assert your value. You just need to know who you are and be willing to stand in that truth. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the story was not Judith's removal from the board, but the way the neighborhood changed afterward. People began to talk, to help each other, to show up. Malcolm didn't just stand up for himself. He unknowingly gave others the permission to stand up too. And that's the ripple effect of courage. It starts with one person saying, "No more," and ends with a whole community rediscovering what it means to belong. Especially for older adults, many of whom may feel isolated, overlooked, or disconnected, this story offers a reminder that you still have influence. You still set the tone for what is tolerated. And by speaking up, even softly, you might just help others find their voice. In the end, this story is a tribute to dignity, to the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need fanfare, but transforms everything it touches. It's a story for anyone who's ever been overlooked, for the widower with the perfect lawn who's told he doesn't look like he belongs in a Rolls Royce, for the woman fined over garden gnomes because someone didn't like the way they looked, for the man who's written off because he doesn't argue back, and for all of us who've ever swallowed frustration in the name of peace and wondered quietly when enough would finally be enough. This story says, you matter. Your voice matters. And your peace is worth protecting. It reminds us that we don't have to become loud to be powerful. We just have to be clear.